My name is Ashley, and I'm 27 years old. I grew up as an only child, with a but doubtful father and an energetic, lively mother. Their marriage was happy and full of love, even though my mom could be a bit over the top sometimes. Seeing their relationship made me want a similar marriage when I got older. I met my husband, Judson, through a friend. Both of our families work in the food business, but his family owns a well-known French restaurant that has done really well. With several locations around New York City, Judson is the heir to the business and helps run it. When we were dating, I enjoyed hearing Judson's stories about the restaurant and his big dreams, but after we got married, I started to get annoyed whenever he compared my family's restaurant to his, especially when he said things like, "Running a famous restaurant is tough, unlike your family's business, which seems like it's going under." It was tiring to argue back, especially since my family's restaurant was not failing. What bothered me even more was that Judson wasn't the one keeping his family's business successful. It was his cousin Todd. Todd, who was taken in by Judson's family after being orphaned, was the one who actually worked hard to keep the business going. Judson would call Todd his brother, but in reality, he treated him like a servant. From what I could see, without Todd and my mother-in-law, the family's business would probably fall apart. My father-in-law and Judson were just arrogant. Judson believed that since his family had saved Todd from being an orphan, Todd owed them and should repay the favor by working for them, and my father-in-law thought that because my mother-in-law was his wife, it was her duty to serve him. To both of them, Todd and my mother-in-law were just tools to use, not valued members of the family. My mother-in-law and Todd were both kind people. After Todd graduated from college at 24, he started working as Judson's assistant, almost like his secretary. My mother-in-law once spoke to me with a sad expression, saying, "Todd would have been happier if he had been adopted by other relatives. My husband only took him in because he thought Todd would be useful." She was clearly worried about Todd, but she couldn't openly stand up for him in front of her husband and Judson. Judson, despite being the heir to the business, was not very good at his job. That's why he felt threatened by Todd's competence and treated him harshly. Judson would often complain to me about the employees and Todd, saying things like, "The staff only listen to Todd. They don't follow my orders." The truth was, the employees knew Todd was capable and respected him. They didn't want to follow Judson's orders because they had their own complaints about him. Todd, meanwhile, was caught in the middle, trying to get the staff to follow Judson's unreasonable demands while keeping things running smoothly. Todd and my mother-in-law rarely voiced their opinions openly. Instead, they quietly followed the orders of my father-in-law and Judson, but behind the scenes, they would adjust their foolish plans into better, more sensible instructions. They worked hard to make sure the business didn't fail, all while making my father-in-law and Judson look good. This is why the employees respected both Todd and my mother-in-law. Since getting married, I've watched all of them closely and realized that Todd and my mother-in-law were not just kind, but also very wise and capable. They knew that if they pushed their own way too much, it would create conflict. Instead, they quietly earned the trust of the employees by doing what was best for the business. While Todd and my mother-in-law worked hard to protect the dignity of my father-in-law and Judson, both of them were clueless and incompetent. They didn't realize that their success was only because of the capable people around them. If they were smarter, they would appreciate Todd and my mother-in-law more. But instead, they believed they were the most competent just because they held the top positions. They looked down on everyone else, thinking too highly of themselves. When I visited my hometown, I told my parents about this. My mom, eating her potato soup, quickly said, "Ashley, just get a divorce and come back home." My dad gave a small, bitter smile at her suggestion. It felt too early to talk about divorce since Judson and I hadn't even been married for 6 months. I was disappointed in Judson and my father-in-law, but Todd and my mother-in-law were good people. I couldn't just rush into divorce. I smiled weakly at my mom's comment, and my dad nodded gently, but my mom, already eating her second bowl of soup, added, "Why don't you get a divorce, marry Todd, and come help us at our pizza shop?" Mom, Don't say weird things, I protested. My dad then kindly asked, Ashley, are you troubled by something? I sighed, knowing my dad was gentle but very perceptive. So, I gave in and started talking about my problems with Judson. Judson is really difficult, I began. He looks down on me just because my family runs a small pizza shop, and that alone is frustrating. But there's more, gets jealous just because I talk to Todd and accuses me of cheating. Todd and I don't have any romantic feelings for each other. He's practically like a brother to me. When I talked to my mother-in-law about this, she sighed deeply. She told me that in the past, there was a female employee that Judson was interested in. However, that woman admired Todd instead of Judson. Angry and upset, Judson made up an excuse and fired her. It may sound harsh, Ashley, my mother-in-law said, but Judson hates losing to Todd. It's not exactly jealousy, it's more of a twisted sense of competition. That's why Todd tries to keep his conversations with you to a minimum. I'm really tired of Judson's selfishness, but I can only imagine how exhausted Todd must be, working with him every day. When I told my mom about Judson's annoying personality, she was shocked. What a petty man, he's too insecure, don't you think, honey? She asked my dad. He agreed with a nod. Talking with my parents always made me feel better. My mom has always been full of energy, and it was hard for my late grandfather to find the right match for her. She was beautiful and popular, but a bit too energetic for most men. Since she was the oldest daughter, her family needed a son-in-law to take over their family business. But most of the men my grandfather introduced were intimidated by her lively personality. Eventually, my grandfather thought a calm and gentleman would be a good fit for her, and that's when my dad entered the picture. He was the son of my grandfather's close friend and was known for his kindness and intelligence. When my parents first met, it was my mom who fell for him right away. According to her, my dad looked like a handsome actor when he was younger, and even now, he's considered a refined man by the customers at our pizza shop. My dad was drawn to my mom's lively spirit, and they decided to marry. As I watched my parents chat happily, I suddenly remembered something important. Can I bring Judson, my in-laws, and Todd here next time? I asked. This would be the first time my in-laws and Todd would visit my parents' home. My mother-in-law wanted to meet my parents again, so she convinced my father-in-law and Judson to come. Although they were hesitant, surprisingly, Todd volunteered to come too. I think he was worried that my father-in-law or Judson might act rudely. My parents were happy to say yes. Of course, we'll show them how amazing our pizza is, my mom said, getting way too excited. Ma'am, calm down, I laughed. That's how I ended up planning to bring my in-laws to my parents' pizza shop. Deep down, I had a feeling it wouldn't be smooth sailing. Todd usually steps in when my mother-in-law can't control my father-in-law and Judson, so I was sure something unpleasant was bound to happen. Finally, the day came when we all visited my parents' pizza shop. The moment Judson saw the place, he sneered, still as old-fashioned as ever. Luckily, my mom wasn't there to hear him. If she had, Judson might have been banned from the shop on the spot. Ignoring his comment, I went inside, hoping things wouldn't spiral out of control. My mom was all smiles as she welcomed everyone. Long time no see, Judson. Ashley's told me a lot about you, she said, her tone friendly but with a hint of sarcasm. Of course, she didn't mean it in a good way, but Judson didn't catch on. He actually looked quite pleased, as if my mom had just paid him a big compliment. My in-laws seemed clueless, but Todd caught the hidden meaning. He smiled, which was rare for him, so I knew he understood what was really going on. After greeting Judson and my in-laws, my mom turned to Todd. You must be Todd. Wow, you're so tall and handsome I could be a model. Todd, clearly a bit overwhelmed by my mom's enthusiasm, smiled awkwardly. Thank you, I'm looking forward to today, he said, shaking her hand politely before heading to the room with the rest of my in-laws. Meanwhile, my dad was busy making pizza in the back. My mom started setting out drinks and some of our popular side dishes when my father-in-law scoffed loudly. This place is old and dirty, just like your mother. His words sent a chill down my spine. Mine, ma'am, who had been right in front of me preparing drinks, Francie. I was terrified to even glance at her. Suddenly, I heard her voice, but it was different, low and dangerous. "Say that again," she said. It was a tone I had never heard from her before, and it was terrifying. My mother-in-law and Todd tried to stop him, but my father-in-law pushed on. "Both this shop and the old woman running it are filthy. I'll probably get food poisoning." Judson, who had been standing nearby, smirked, clearly enjoying the scene. My mom's anger boiled over. Without a word, she put away the drinks she had been preparing and instead grabbed a 1-liter bottle of wine. She turned to my father-in-law, her eyes fierce. "If you don't want your head cracked open like a watermelon, you'd better get up and leave." My father-in-law, shocked by her intensity, still managed to sneer as he muttered, "Just like the daughter, the mother is ugly too." Before I knew it, my mom started swinging the wine bottle, and my dad had to rush in to hold her back. "Honey, calm down," he said, trying to ease the tension with a smile. But it was already too late. My father-in-law and Judson stormed out, spitting on the floor as they left. My mom, furious, tried to chase after them, but my dad and I held her back as best we could. "How dare he call me an old woman? It's Miss Munn," she shouted. "Ma'am, that's really not the point here," I said, though I was just as angry. The whole thing had been infuriating. Once we finally managed to calm my mom down, my mother-in-law and Todd apologized over and over, though they really had nothing to apologize for. The real issue was my father-in-law and Jason's condescending attitudes. Their rude comments about our family and our shop had been the root of the entire mess. I was furious about the cruel things Jason and my father-in-law said. My mother-in-law, noticing how upset I was, gently spoke to me. "Ashley, I'm really sorry. My husband and Judson, they won't change. You might want to consider divorce for your own good." Todd, who was usually quiet, added his thoughts. "Says, these kinds of things will keep happening. It might be best for you to distance yourself." Looking at their regretful faces, I felt torn. Divorce was an option, but I felt bad for my mother-in-law and Todd, while my dad and I were unsure of what to do. My mom spoke up bluntly. "You two don't look happy, especially you. Todd, you could leave if you wanted to, right?" When my mom asked why Todd let himself be pushed around by someone like Judson, he glanced at my mother-in-law. "I'm worried about my aunt. I can't just leave her after everything she's done for me." Todd didn't care about my father-in-law or Judson, but he was concerned for my mother-in-law. He also worried that if he left, the other employees would suffer under Judson and my father-in-law's selfishness. His sense of responsibility and care for his aunt were what kept him from leaving. Hearing Todd's true feelings, my mother-in-law started crying. She felt guilty that Todd couldn't live freely because of her. As my dad and I exchanged confused looks, unsure of how to help, my mom lightly tapped Todd and my mother-in-law's shoulders and laughed. "Oh, that's easy. Leave it to me." Her cheerful attitude surprised them both, and even my dad seemed to know what my mom had in mind. I made my decision too. After discussing what we should do next, I went home, where Judson was waiting. The first thing I said to him was, "I'm cutting ties with your family." I couldn't forgive what my father-in-law had said. Judson just laughed coldly, completely unfazed. He wasn't the type to apologize. "All right, then, divorce it is," he said, mocking my family's pizza shop and acting like he was fine with the split. I handed him the divorce papers I had already prepared and gave him one last warning. "No matter what happens, don't come crying to me after the divorce." Judson didn't seem to understand and brushed it off. "I'll pay you all the money, you poor piece of shop girl." I didn't need his money, but I nodded just to avoid raising suspicion. And so, 6 months later, Judson and I were divorced. Aside from my mother-in-law and Todd, 80% of my life had been stressful, and after my father-in-law's cruel comments, it became 100%. After the divorce, I moved back in with my parents. About a month later, Judson and my ex-father-in-law showed up at my door, pale and panicked. "My wife and Todd, they're gone." They left divorce papers and a note saying they were cutting ties with us. I turned to my ex-father-in-law and said with a smirk, "How unfortunate a late life divorce." Ah. As I laughed, Judson, looking even more pale, spoke up. The employees who admired Todd have quit. I've been betrayed by my brother. I was stunned by his selfishness when suddenly a cold voice cut through the air. Don't call me your brother just when it's convenient for you. I never considered you my brother. Todd appeared out of nowhere, leaving my ex-father-in-law and Judson in shock. Then, quietly, my former mother-in-law emerged from behind him. As they stood dumbfounded, my mom confidently entered the scene. These two have joined us. Oh, and by the way, we've taken over your French restaurant. My ex-father-in-law broke into a cold sweat at my mom's bold declaration, while my dad, calmly watching the situation, smiled modestly. It's not a big deal, my dad said. Running a pizza shop has just been a hobby. My wife's family owns a chain of restaurants, and they were kind enough to accept me as their son-in-law. When my dad mentioned the name of our family's restaurant company, my ex-father-in-law and Judson visibly faltered. They knew their small restaurant business was no match for the size and power of our company. There was a reason my parents ran a pizza shop instead of being more involved in the family business. A few years ago, my dad collapsed from overwork. Doctors recommended he find something he enjoyed to help with his recovery. So my mom and I reopened my late grandfather's pizza shop, which he had run as a hobby. In a sense, my parents were just laying low, while still overseeing their family's vast restaurant empire. In their absence, skilled and loyal employees managed the company. My parents, well respected by their staff, had complete trust in them. Under my mother's leadership, our company took over the French restaurant that my ex-father-in-law and Judson had been running. While they had been complacent, the situation had shifted. Looking at the stunned faces of my ex-father-in-law and Judson, my dad calmly stated, based on my observations, you both lack the skills to run a business. Your employees have voiced their concerns about your management. Therefore, we demand your resignation. Standing beside my dad, who was delivering the news in such a composed manner, my mom firmly added, Todd will now manage the French restaurant. Todd, you can't do whatever you want with these two them, roast them, crush them, it's up to you. My ex-father-in-law and Judson tried to protest. You can't do that without our approval. But it was useless. This decision wasn't just my parents', it reflected the will of all the employees, who had long been frustrated with their management. My ex-mother-in-law had now teamed up with Todd, her nephew, giving them the power to fire my ex-father-in-law and Judson. Todd exchanged a glance with her and said calmly, I owe you for taking me in when I was a child. At first, my ex-father-in-law and Judson felt a flicker of hope from Todd's kind smile, but that hope quickly disappeared. Todd's expression turned cold, and he said in an icy voice, but my grudge against you is 100 billion times greater. For Judson, it's 500 billion times greater. In short, Todd made it clear he wasn't going to forgive or show mercy. He announced that he was stripping both my ex-father-in-law and Judson of all their management authority. Then, my ex-mother-in-law added something even more terrifying. I'd rather you disappear from my sight, but I'll let you stay on as low-level workers. As I watched this unfold, I realized something important. People like my mother, who express their emotions openly, are actually more predictable. I can see when she's reaching her limit, which helps me mentally prepare. But the scariest people are those like Todd and my ex-mother-in-law. They endure a lot without complaint until they hit their breaking point, and when they do, it's devastating. My ex-father-in-law and Judson had underestimated these two and were now facing the consequences. It wasn't just about the divorce from Matthew had also lost valuable employees and trust. Foolish people assume that kind individuals will always forgive, but once patience runs out, things fall apart. Judson, humiliated, cried as he was forced to work under Todd. My ex-father-in-law shouted at Todd, calling him ungrateful, but it was too late. Despite the gratitude Todd once felt, his grudge far outweighed it. As they slinked away in defeat, I said, the mouth really is the gate of evil. My father, smiling, replied, angering your mother was the end of their lot. Watching my father, I realized that though he seems gentle, he's not afraid to ruin those who insult my mother all with his smile. After that, Mike's father-in-law and Judson disappeared with severance pay. They tried starting a new business, but it failed. Meanwhile, Todd and my ex-mother-in-law successfully took over the French restaurant, earning the trust of the employees. Todd, usually quiet, had become more open with his emotions. I continued to work in the pizza restaurant, enjoying my job in the food service industry, something I had done before marriage. One day, on my day off, I visited my parents' pizza place and saw my ex-mother-in-law consulting with my mom. When I asked if something had happened, they told me, Todd is about to turn 25, and is upset that he's so focused on work that he doesn't have a girlfriend. I sighed, but my mother, always lively, said, there are plenty of girls who will want to marry a handsome, good man like Todd. I realized my mother was excited about introducing Todd to potential marriage prospects. It crossed my mind that Todd might already have someone in mind, and I worried they were being too pushy by arranging a meeting without consulting him first. When I mentioned this concern to my father, he just smiled knowingly. Suddenly, I heard my mother call for me. She looked at my face and smirked. You've been listening to our conversation, haven't you? Yes, I was. But Mom, you can set up a marriage meeting without asking Todd first. Mike's mother-in-law and my mother left together, which only added to my confusion. Mike's mother-in-law said, we know who Todd likes, but he just can't say it himself. Then my mother added, Todd said he likes you, Ashley, but because you're like his sister-in-law, he feels hesitant. I was taken aback. I hadn't noticed Todd's feelings at all. He was the kind of person who kept things to himself, so I was completely unaware. Although I thought he was a wonderful man, I didn't feel any romantic feelings for him right away. When I expressed my honest feelings to my mother and Mike's mother-in-law, my father chimed in, it's okay. Todd said he'd take his time and gradually make you fall for him. Dad, I wish you hadn't said that, I exclaimed. At my outburst, both my mother and ex-mother-in-law burst into laughter. That's when I found out that Todd had been quietly harboring a one-sided crush on me. Knowing it would take a long time for Todd to confess his feelings, I decided to ask him out first. Looking back, I realized it was a clever strategy on Todd's part. Although we started off as a couple, I later asked him when he first developed romantic feelings for me. Todd just smiled mysteriously and never gave me a straight answer. 2 years later, we got married. In hindsight, I noticed how calm my father and thoughtful Todd were quite similar. It made me laugh to realize that my mother and I shared similar tastes in men.